Well, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm going to do a fair bit of reading because of the historical facts and figures I need to get right for you and the details, as well as I want to read a fair bit of quotes from Josephine herself to give it that personal touch. But first of all, this statement, too Christian for the suffragettes, too suffragette for the Christians. What do you think this means? What do you think this could be about? Yeah, if you explain. Thank you. So it's a phrase that this woman, Sarah Williams, coined about Josephine Butler, although Josephine Butler wasn't really known for the right to vote, etc., but she did a lot for women. But even before the term feminism was coined, she was a real trailblazer. She stood in a unique place. She fought for justice for women, not to make a name for herself, to be known as a feminist. And the term wasn't even in currency then. Like Irene said, it was about 1890. Her work was earlier. And we are now in the fourth wave of feminism. When she's reviewed, she's looked at in the first wave of feminism, but it was women that started to speak up for the rights of women. They felt there was an injustice in society where men were oppressing women and there was unfairness. But so our understanding is very, very different now compared to in Victorian society. So bear that in mind. But Josephine herself was really driven by her Christian beliefs and her practice for God's kingdom to be displayed on earth. Her ministry is born out of and fueled by prayer. She was an ardent intercessor, and her prayer life underpinned everything she did. She wrote in her diary, "I long to have 100 voices, that with all of them I might pray without ceasing, that Christ will come quickly and deliver forever the poor, groaning world." So out of her sense of conviction, she advocated for the poor and destitute, those who were being oppressed by sin and gender inequality, and she fought for justice for women to be treated fairly. But she fell out of step with her notoriety in the second wave of feminism in the 60s, when it was like being redefined, and she didn't quite fit their box of feminism because she was such a strong Christian and she had such a strong faith. So she wasn't really counted with those brand of feminists. And at the same time, she wasn't included in the Christian literature when they look back in history books, because for the Christians, she was counted as too feminist. So she kind of slipped through the cracks in the history, hence that opening statement. So she's rather known as the forgotten saint. And if she's known at all, she's known as the patron saint of prostitutes. So trigger alert, we'll be talking about sexual issues, and some points might make you feel uncomfortable. But thankfully, there are sources you can learn about her life and legacy. With this advent nowadays of uncovering hidden histories, there are people who are curious about the work that she's done and the measures she accomplished, like this woman, Dr. Sarah Williams. There's a resurgence of people knowing about Josephine Butler now, and Sarah Williams has got some things on YouTube and speaks at conferences and other events, educating women in what wonderful work that Josephine Butler did. And also online, you can find out about her work and through libraries. So just to name a few, you've got the Josephine Butler Society, the Liverpool University Library, the London School of Economics and Political Science, where you have archives of the Josephine Butler Society Library. She's got an English Heritage Blue Plaque, and therefore a write-up about her on the English Heritage site, and even a BBC page, to name a few. So now we're going to watch So that's a picture of her when she was younger, when she was older. We're going to watch a little clip that just gives you a brief overview so you can get a flavour of her and her life. Thanks. Okay. Yes, please. Okay, so I'll just retrack some of her history. Josephine Gray was born on the 13th of April 1828 at Millfield in Northumberland. She was the fourth daughter and seventh child of Hannah and John Gray. John Gray was a land agent and agricultural expert, and he was a cousin of the reformist British Prime Minister, Lord Grey, the Earl Grey, yes, who made the Earl Grey tea. So every time you drink a cup of Earl Grey tea, remember Josephine. And so she was number 7 out of 9 surviving children. There were 11, but sadly two passed away. So in 1833, John was appointed manager of the Greenwich Hospital Estates in Dilston, near Corbridge, Northumberland. So the family moved to the area where John acted as Lord Grey's chief political agent in Northumberland. In this role, John promoted his cousin's political opinions locally, including support for the abolition of slavery, the repeal of the Corn Laws, and reform of the Poor Laws. Josephine was taught at home before completing her schooling at a boarding school in Newcastle upon Tyne, when she attended there for 2 years with her sister Hattie. So John, her father, treated his children equally within the home. He educated them in politics and social issues and exposed them to various politically important visitors. John's political work and ideology had a strong influence on his daughter, as did the religious teaching she received from her mum, Hannah, the family background, and the circles in which she moved. They formed a strong social conscience and a strong religious faith in her. To note, another influential Christian in her life was Jane Cranston. She was the Gray family nurse, whose habit of sustained communion with God etched itself deep into Josephine's mind. Josephine and her sister Hattie went with their nurse to a meeting house during a revival that swept through the Cheviot Hills, and these memories made a great impression on her. And she describes the sense of excitement at fervour at these meetings, the vigorous hymn singing and revivalist preaching. So her family attended St Andrew's Parish Church. In her late teens, though, she reached like a watershed moment in her spiritual formation. She had a year-long struggle, which she compared to Jacob's struggle with God. And she often took herself out to local woods and pine forest and wrestled in prayer for hours. And she didn't want a second-hand faith. She wanted to know God for herself. She really, really longed to know God personally. And then she did come to know him, and this weight lifted. She said 2 things resulted: a firm resolution to pursue intimacy with God as a chief priority of her life, and the establishment of a consistent lifelong practice of prayer. And around this time, they think when she was about 17, when she was praying on the Cheviot Hills in Northumberland, Josephine had a profound sense of the world being out of joint. She was really concerned about the injustice of the world, and she had this sense of the world's wrong, it's out of joint, it's out of kilter, and she had a real sense of the injustice at the heart of society. And she writes down, because she was a great writer, and she wrote a load of notes, and so we got a lot of her own words, and she wrote this. A strange intuition was given to me whereby I saw a vision, before I'd seen any of them with my bodily eyes. Some of the saddest miseries of earth, the injustices, the inequalities, the cruelties practiced by man on man, by man on woman. And that fueled her to pray even more. And she had a feeling then that she would be called on to do something to combat this injustice. And she could never shake that feeling. It grew and grew and grew in her. So she married George Butler in 1852, and he was an esteemed cleric and clergyman. They had 4 children together, 3 boys, George, Arthur, who's also known as Stanley, Charlie, and a beautiful little girl called Eva. But there's a real tragedy that happened. The family had been on holiday, and then they'd come back from holiday. I'll read you from the book what happened. George and Josephine had an appointment for tea that afternoon, and Josephine sat at her dressing table, ready to go out. Eva bounced into the room to show her a caterpillar she had found in the garden and to ask for a box to put it in. Josephine found a suitable box, but preoccupied, she ushered Eva from her room. Now trot away, for I'm late for tea. Those words would haunt her for the rest of her life. Because when George and Josephine returned from their outing, the children rushed from the top floor nursery to say goodnight to their parents in the drawing room. In the exuberance, Eva toppled over the banisters and fell 40 feet into the tiled hallway below. So it's horrendous. So they said they heard the screams, then she fell on the floor, silence. Her dad picked her up, and then 3 hours later she died. Charlie saw it as well, and he was really wounded by this, and Josephine and Charlie had to go out often in the afternoon in their horse and carriage because it was so traumatic. But, Eva's death, it was a turning point in Josephine's life, and so she navigated the grief of Eva's death in prayer. From an entry in her private thoughts journal we read, "Today I stood before the Lord. He granted me an audience. He had in his hand the petition I desired of him, to pray, this is my life, this is my true, my only life. What is life to me without it?" So she was absolutely grief-stricken, poured her life and everything into the Lord. A few years later, they moved to Liverpool in 1866. They moved to Liverpool because George Butler was appointed as principal of Liverpool College. George and the boys went off to school each day, leaving Josephine alone and often depressed. And she was still grief-stricken, absolutely grief-stricken over the death of her beautiful little girl. And she said, "I suffered much during those first months in our new home. I became possessed with an irresistible desire to go forth and find some pain keener than my own, to meet with people more unhappy than myself, for I knew there were thousands of such. I only knew that when my heart ached night and day, the only solace would seem to be to find other hearts that ached night and day with more reason than mine." And then following the advice of her cousin, Charles Birrell, a Baptist minister in Liverpool, to concentrate her energy, she began to visit the women in the local workhouse. So she turned her grief outwards to helping other people. She writes this, "I had no clear idea beyond that, no plan for helping others. My sole wish was to plunge into the hearts of some human misery and to say, as I knew I could, to afflicted people, I understand, I too have suffered." Okay, next slide. So first of all, she went to the Brownlow workhouse. So I've identified 4 impacts that she accomplished in her life. So she went to the Brownlow Hill workhouse and was absolutely appalled at the conditions that over 4,000, nearly 5,000 women and girls were living in there. It was absolute concentrated, massive misery. In the cellar, there were oakum sheds, where in exchange for bread and a few nights' shelter, impoverished women, many of them engaged in penny prostitution, they separated loose fibres of old rope for caulking in wooden ships. So Liverpool was like a seaport, and they'd have these ships, and the ropes were covered in tar, and they had to pick the tar off and pick the fibres of the ropes apart. Here's a testimony from her. She said, "I went down to the oakum sheds and begged admission. I was taken into an immense gloomy vault filled with women and girls, more than 200 probably at that time. I sat on the floor among them and picked oakum. They laughed at me and told me my fingers were no use for that work, which was true, but while we laughed, we became friends." So it wasn't uncommon for middle-class women at that time to be involved in so-called like rescue work with prostitutes and other fallen women at the time, what they were deemed as. But Josephine, she went further. She didn't stay aloof. She went down into the cellar, sat with them, spoke with them, laughed with them. She taught them scriptures to recite, and then she did prayer moves to the centre. And there's another section that I want to read here. "I proposed they should learn a few verses to say to me on my next visit. I recollect a tall, dark, handsome girl standing up in our midst among the damp refuse and lumps of tarred rope and repeating without a mistake and in not unmusical voice, clear and ringing, that wonderful chapter of St. John's Gospel. The words of Jesus, all through ending with, 'Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid.' She had selected it herself, and they listened in perfect silence, this audience, wretched, bedraggled, ignorant, criminal some, and wild and defiant others. The tall, dark-haired girl had prepared the way for me, and I said, 'Let us kneel and cry to that same Jesus who spoke these words.' And down on their knees they fell, every one of them, reverently on that damp stone floor, some saying the words after me, others moaning and weeping. It was a strange sound, that united wail, continuous, pitiful, strong, like a great sigh or murmur of vague desire and hope, issuing from the heart of despair, piercing the gloom and murky atmosphere of that vaulted room, and reaching to the heart of God." And then Sarah herself writes, "In this portrait prayer, we witness transformation." So imagine that scene, reciting scripture, and praying, and all calling out to the Lord. Consequently, Josephine, she didn't use society's term when referring to these women as fallen women. She used the biblical term of them being an outcast. So she didn't deem them as being less of a person. She saw them as being created in the image of God, equal in worth and value, but those who had been rejected somewhat and cast aside of society. And this shines a light on those doing the outcasting. So Josephine, she also brought some of those in most dire need to be hosted in the spare rooms in the Butler's family home. There's a really touching story in the book about a girl called Mary, a woman called Mary. She renames her Mariam to protect her identity. But she worked as an undermaid in a middle-class home. And she was only 15 when she was raped by the gentleman of the house. She was impregnated, and then she was cast out by her employers and her family. She was left destitute and no option than to turn to prostitution. A brothel owner took her in, and she was, used for prostitution. Mary was in Brownlow Hill, and she was wild and half dead when Josephine locked eyes with her at that workhouse. Josephine had compassion on her, saying, "Will you come home with me and live with me? I had a daughter once." And Josephine writes, she, meaning Mary, she replied with a gasp of astonishment, grasping my hand as if she would never let it go again. I brought her home. So Mary was gravely ill in the late stages of consumption, but during her time there with the Butlers and under their ministry of them both sharing Jesus and praying for her, she received Christ and she was transformed, they said, into a vessel of light. Those who visited her were blessed by the presence of Christ. And Mary died 3 months after, but was promoted to glory. There was more and more women in need coming forth. And so using donations from Liverpool merchants and a network of personal friends and supporters, George and Josephine rented a nearby house to help provide shelter, training and employment opportunities for the women. George opened the house with a service of prayer, and within weeks it was filled with women and girls, and they called it the House of Rest. And it was successfully managed by a matron that Josephine called Mother. And they turned one room of the house into an envelope factory, which provided respectable work for the women. Second impact was a higher education for women. She took a great interest in women's education and began campaigning for improved education for women, and was a signatory on the first women's suffrage petition presented to Parliament in June 1866. Josephine pressured the authorities at Cambridge Uni to provide further education courses for women, which eventually led to the foundation of the All-Women College at Newnham. She was appointed president to the North of England Council for the Higher Education of Women in 1867, and in 1868 her first pamphlet, The Education and Employment of Women, was published. A digital copy of this pamphlet can be found today online. I saw it myself on the Wellcome Collection website. It's really detailed and, it's really worth a look. The impact that she's probably known most widely for is this one, the Contagious Diseases Act from 1869 to 1886. So in 1869, the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act was founded. When she was asked to lead the campaign, Josephine didn't say yes straight away. Now, we're going to watch a clip later where they said, oh, she did, but she didn't. She wrestled with this for 3 months alone. She really, really wrestled with this. But again, she had a growing sense that God was calling her for this task. She wrote, I felt that for such an enterprise, I should require nothing less than the whole armour of God. And she found a note in an old manuscript book from a debate about the Act in the House of Commons 3 years prior, in 1866. And the note had her writings on it, and it noted a sense that if she was to be called on to meet this evil, and on it a short prayer, that if I must descend into the darkness, that the divine hand, whose touch is health and strength, would hold mine fast in the darkness. So in the autumn of 1869, she was wrestling, and she compared herself to Jonah. She said, I fled from the face of the Lord. I worked hard at other things, good works as I thought, with a kind of half-conscious hope that God would accept that work and not require me to go further and run my heart against that naked sword which seemed to be held out. So she knew God was calling her to this deeper work, a darker work, but she was wanting to combat it with all her other works, but she just had that sense that she was being like Jonah and running away. But as she prayed, she had this, again, growing, deep and profound anger about the injustice of the acts. Where the anger itself and outrage wouldn't be enough, she prayed for a settled and firm conviction. I pray thee, O God, to give me a deep, well-governed and lifelong hatred of all such injustice, tyranny and cruelty, and at the same time give me a divine compassion which is willing to live and suffer long for love of souls, to fling itself into the breach and die at once. So she had deeper convictions then. This is what God was calling her to. There was many, she knew, that could continue her educational work, but few who would go down into this deeper and hidden work. And she decided to tell her husband, George, and his response contained his heart and soul. He simply said, go, and God be with you. And so Josephine Butler stepped aside from her higher education role and began her campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act. These had been introduced in the 1860s to reduce venereal disease in the armed forces. And police were permitted to arrest women living in seaports and military towns who they believed were prostitutes and force them to be examined for venereal disease. No such examinations happened for men, it was just the women, and it could happen on suspicion. Josephine toured the country, making speeches condemning the act. Many people were shocked that a woman would speak in public about sexual matters. We're going to watch a 6-minute clip now that kind of brings it to life, a dramatised version of this scene and this area of her life.
Then significantly expanded in 1866 and 1869. The official
Can you see?
and Royal Navy. Infection rates in some units ran as high as 1 in 3. Parliament decided the most efficient solution was to regulate the women those soldiers visited, not the soldiers themselves. The logic was brutally simple. Men would always seek out women. Therefore, the women must be controlled. Under the Acts, special plainclothes officers from the Metropolitan Police operated in 18 designated military and naval towns across southern England, including Plymouth, Portsmouth, Southampton, Chatham, Woolwich, Colchester, and several others. These officers had sweeping, almost unchecked powers. They could identify any woman as a suspected prostitute based on nothing more than where she was walking, what she was wearing, or who she was seen speaking with. A woman spotted near military barracks after dark could be detained. A woman drinking alone in a public house could be flagged. A woman simply walking through a certain neighborhood at a certain hour was enough. Once identified, the woman was brought before a magistrate and ordered to submit to what the law politely called a medical examination. In practice, this meant a speculum examination performed by a government-appointed surgeon. The conditions were often rough, the equipment crude, and sometimes unsterilized. Women who endured the procedure described it in language that left no ambiguity. Some called it surgical rape. Others simply said it was the most degrading experience of their lives. The speculums themselves were large, metal instruments that were frequently reused between patients with minimal cleaning. The examinations were performed with no regard for the women's pain, dignity, or consent. If the examination found evidence of venereal disease, the woman was confined to a lock hospital, a specialized facility for venereal patients, for a period that could stretch up to 9 months under the expanded Acts. During this confinement, she had essentially no rights. She could not leave. She could not refuse further examinations. She could not appeal. She was, for all practical purposes, a prisoner of the state, convicted of nothing except being poor, female, and standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the system was not even effective at its stated goal. Disease rates in the regulated towns showed no significant improvement compared to unregulated areas. The men who carried and spread the same diseases walked free without a single question asked of them. The entire burden of a problem created by both sexes fell exclusively on the bodies of women. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In late 1869, a group of reformers began organizing formal opposition to the Acts. They had been agitating quietly for months, but they needed a public face. They needed someone who could speak on a platform, someone with enough social standing to command attention, and someone willing to permanently attach their name and reputation to a cause that polite Victorian society considered too disgusting to mention over tea. They asked several prominent women first. Every one of them said no. The personal risk was too great. Speaking publicly about venereal disease, sex work, and police examinations of women's bodies would destroy a respectable woman's reputation overnight. Then they approached Josephine Butler. She said yes within hours. On January
3 months.
1st, 1870, Butler published what became known as the Ladies' Protest in the Daily News, a major national newspaper. It was a public letter signed by over 2,000 women, including Florence Nightingale, Harriet Martineau, and dozens of other prominent figures. The letter argued that the Contagious Diseases Acts punished women for the actions of men, that they violated the fundamental principle of habeas corpus, and that they placed unchecked power in the hands of moral
Okay, that's enough.
Hit subscribe.
That's it. Okay, so it just kind of dramatises it, brings to life, doesn't it, the impact. But goodness me, what persecution. So just a question, what point would you have stopped? She's incredible, isn't she? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so these hurdles she encountered, they only encouraged her even the more to succeed in her mission to help women. And in just 1 year, she travelled nearly, she's addressed 104 public meetings, and they said each one was tailored, it was different. She tailored it to the context and the audience that was there, and travelled nearly 4,000 miles. It ended up in countless, dangerous, exhausting situations, some of which we've just seen. But by 1871, she had generated enough public pressure and media attention that Parliament was forced to convene a royal commission to investigate the workings of the Contagious Diseases Act. And she was called on to testify, becoming one of the first women in British history to give formal evidence in a parliamentary inquiry of this kind. And she spoke for hours. Like I said there, she described the system with the precision of a prosecutor, naming locations, dates, officers, specific women who had been harmed. So she'd gathered all her details and was meticulous in all her investigations and her evidence that she disclosed. But finally, in 1883, the acts were suspended and repealed 3 years later. Under her leadership, the campaign resulted in the repeal in 1886, and so that's a truly remarkable achievement, isn't it? 17 years of diligent campaigning, all the while underpinned by prayer, facing persecution, and enduring in the face of opposition. The final impact to note was the age of consent. So at the time in the 1800s, there was no law against having sex with a child aged 12 or older. Sexual exploitation remained under the surface of culture in the form of child prostitution. People turned a blind eye to it. They turned a blind eye to those who molested the disadvantaged without conscience or accountability. So Josephine's investigations revealed this wasn't only a national scourge. Child prostitution and sex trafficking was happening on the continent too. And she formed now known as the International Abolition Federation. Then it was called the British and Continental Federation for the Abolition of Prostitution. She formed it in Liverpool in 1875. This was a Europe-wide organisation aimed to abolish state regulation of prostitute and fought the international traffic in women in prostitution. Josephine, she was friends with a Quaker publisher, Alfred Dyer, who, along with his friends Benjamin Waugh, Benjamin Scott, and members of the Salvation Army, formed the Committee for the Exposure and Suppression of the Traffic in Girls. They had exposed child trafficking from England to Brussels and Paris. This committee gathered evidence. In 1882, Dyer appointed a former Scotland Yard detective, a Mr. Minahan, to investigate the dense tangle of organised crime that dominated large areas of the West End of London. So a miracle happened in that a letter that was intended for a Mrs. Jeffreys of Chelsea was sent by mistake to a Miss Jeffreys, also of Chelsea. And in the letter, it asked it was from a foreign dignitary and asked for a little girl for the King of Belgium. Now, that letter provided the necessary evidence to convict Mrs. Jeffreys of the crime she was already known for. She was already infamous for running brothels. She ran 8 brothels in Chelsea, Kensington and Bloomsbury, and also a lucrative business supplying young girls to the gentlemen clubs of Mayfair and St. James. And among her clients were high-profile members of the British aristocracy, members of both Houses of Parliament, along with the King of Belgium, and it was rumoured also the Prince of Wales, but that was a rumour. The court proceedings were a farce. The details of the convictions were managed to protect those powerful people. Jeffreys was only fined £200 and returned to carry on her business. So Josephine was absolutely outraged at this and realised there was still a great deal of work to do to shift the weight of indifference that encumbered society. Josephine was then introduced to William Stead. He was a sensational journalist and editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. Josephine and her friends joined Stead in a risky venture to gather necessary evidence for an exposé, just as Dyer had done previously in Brussels and Paris. In writing to a close friend, Josephine states, I've been 10 days in London helping friends in a most terrible investigation concerning the crimes. Vice is too pale a word of the aristocracy. It seems that all that goes on in Brussels and Paris goes on in London. I have been about the streets all day and sometimes late at night. Oh, what horrors we have seen. And she describes the rooms as places where the girls were subject to cruel and indecent torture, and the sights horrified her, and she felt like she had descended into hell itself. Even Steed found the work unbearable. And this is shocking. Children younger than 12, even young as 4, were being sold into prostitution. Steed felt the burden that his work had to be so specific and demonstrative that it couldn't be contested. So he enlisted the help of a former prostitute, Rebera, who had recently become a Christian, to buy him a girl, Eliza, for £5. But he kept Eliza safe and entrusted her to a friend who took her to Paris, where she was kept safe. And on the strength of his evidence, Steed went to press. And he wrote this article, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. And that contained week-long articles comparing Victorian England with the worst corruptions of the ancient world. And on the back of this, a tidal wave of outrage was unleashed across the country. And then Josephine rode on that tide, and she spoke at what they called indignation meetings in Exeter. And she rallied there the signing of petitions, as she had done previously. And the Salvation Army, under Bramwell Booth, organised a petition of 393,000 signatures, and they carried it to the Houses of Parliament. And so on the 14th of August 1885, the Criminal Law Amendment Act received royal assent. The age of consent to rise it to 16 became law, and that's the same law that we've got today. And the Act also made it a criminal offence to procure girls for prostitution. And so it was a huge, huge success, that. So on the 14th and 22nd of August 1885, more than 250,000 people gathered at Hyde Park to mark the passing of this Act, and this Act still stands today. So a bit about her. She was such a prolific writer of letters, books, pamphlets. She spent several hours every day writing, and it was through her writings that she tirelessly raised awareness across the nation and beyond. And she wrote petitions, encouraging other people to sign them. She boldly uncovered the wrongs that she perceived to be prevalent in society. But she also wrote biographies of those dear to her, her influential father, John Gray, and her beloved husband, George Butler. Apparently the book about George is about so thick, and she wrote it in 2 years after his passing. So I'm sure that was cathartic for her. And that's where we get a lot of the evidence of her words. And she was also enamoured with St. Catherine of Siena, and the book that I read about her has got an interlude in the middle dedicated to St. Catherine and her devout prayer life and faithful persistence. So I'm sure Catherine was a huge inspiration to Josephine. And Josephine passed away peacefully on the 30th of December 1906, and after her death, the feminist leader Millicent Fawcett described Josephine as the most distinguished English woman of the 19th century. So, thinking about some of the lessons we at Grace can learn from Josephine Butler, there's many, I'm sure, but I've picked out a few. Here, I think she represented Christ, so she imitated Christ in her actions, but she took Christ to the marginalised, the downtrodden. She sat with them, she called them her friends, just like what Jesus did with the sinners and tax collectors. She was faithful in her calling, she was faithful in the small things and the big things. She was a loving and faithful wife, a mother. She started off visiting women in the workhouse, took some into her home, provided houses for them to live in and learn new skills. She advocated for change in the educational and political spheres, and she campaigned and worked tirelessly. It was like the Lord could trust her with small things, and he gave her more and more and more, and could trust her with those too. She used her talents. She herself was highly educated and used her intelligence and eloquence to write, to speak, to persuade. She used her position and power to advocate for the poor, the destitute, the needy. She was incredibly tenacious and saw her work through to completion. And she sacrificially gave. She poured out her life. She never earned a penny from all of her work. And she gave of herself year after year. But underpinning all of this was her persistent prayer life, and she devoted herself to prayer. Okay, so I was thinking about her character, and she was really bold character, but born, out of her convictions and prayer, and God was with her, definitely. But I thought B for bothered. So she really bothered with the poor and destitute. She didn't just do her duty and pass by. She was offended by the injustice, and at this offence, this righteous anger spurred her to act. She loved people as Christ does. She went to them. She called them friends. She took them in. And she delivered change because of her actions. She was tenacious and determined until new policies made a difference.